Starwalker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, a podcast all about tabletop role-playing games from the perspective of the captain's chair. Joshua Brown joins me on the show today to discuss the Star Wars RPGs by Fantasy Flight Games. So join me on the journey. Together, we can become game masters truly worthy of the title. Hello, listener and fellow GM and or player. Welcome to episode 32 of Game Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. I've got a great show for you today. Joshua Brown is joining me to discuss the Star Wars RPGs. This will be a two-part interview, so first part today. And today we're going to talk about running Star Wars as a new GM and playing the games as a new player. And we talk about how this is a really great game for players who are new to tabletop role-playing games. And then finally, we'll talk a bit about lightsaber colors. Before I get into the interview, I want to real quickly just apologize for the poor audio quality in this interview. We didn't have a very good connection. I think I might have parked the Obsidian Monolith a little too close to a black hole or something. I'm not sure what was up. I did the best that I could to clean it up, and to make it a little bit easier on your ears, I'm going to be shutting down the engines on the Obsidian Monolith and just running on life support, so it'll be easier to hear. So again, sorry about that. I did the best I could with it, but I do think that the message still gets across, which is the most important thing. So real quick, we'll have a word from our sponsor and then on to the interview. We all have busy lives, and the hustle and bustle of modern day living can often leave us feeling anxious and stressed. Do you find yourself longing for your free time, yet when it arrives, you can't unwind? Do you feel restless and on edge? Are you having trouble sleeping at night? Do you wake up exhausted in the morning and dreading the day ahead of you? Are you not finding satisfaction in your romantic relationships? If you are suffering from any of these symptoms, do not despair. There is hope. Audible Books is a new therapy that can help you escape from the grind of your routine. You can sit back, close your eyes, and enjoy a beautiful fantasy world or explore the stars, all without leaving your most comfortable chair or couch or bed. Ask your doctor if Audible is right for you and take the first step to a richer life today. You can try Audible for 30 days for free, courtesy of Starwalker Studios. Just visit the website for your favorite podcast at starwalkerstudios.com and go to the bottom of the latest episode show notes for details. Audible Books. Enjoy a good book today. Joshua Brown is joining me on the show today to talk about the Star Wars RPGs. Welcome to the show, Joshua.
Thank you.
So it's kind of a funny story how you're on the show tonight.
I'm collateral damage.
Yeah. I was tweeting with Ben, who was on a few weeks ago, and you got kind of caught up in the whirlpool of our Twitter conversation. And I'm really happy to have you on the show because you are a GM and player of the Star Wars games.
Yes.
Now, have you had experience with all of them or just certain ones?
Well, I've played Star Wars since the D6.
Nice.
Played through the D20 versions. I took a pass on Saga and then came back for Edge of the Empire and wrapped up a few weeks ago a Force and Destiny beta game.
Awesome. Yeah, I just saw some stuff on Fantasy Flight's website about the upcoming starter box for Force and Destiny, and it looks awesome. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, I'll be running a demo of that probably at my local game store for grins and giggles. I actually really like the beginner boxes.
Yeah. They're a really a good deal, like just from an economic standpoint, because you get an adventure and you get the little kind of punch out tokens and you get the dice.
Yeah, the dice are like $13 on their own. So
right, yeah.
The box is a good deal.
And it's always good to have more dice.
I think I'm running with 3 or 4 sets right now.
Yeah, I have one set, and the couple times I ran Star Wars, I actually did it online, so I didn't need any dice. But I can definitely see that one set would not be enough for very long.
Yeah, especially when you get to high end play, and maybe we'll talk about that a little later.
Yeah.
But when you're throwing difficulties that have, say, 3 red dice or 4 red dice,
right,
it starts to be a little essential to have either the dice roll or a lot of dice.
Now, if you have players that aren't super superstitious about other people touching their dice, and everybody has someone you can share, then I think you do all right.
That's actually raises a really good point for tabletop play that I think adds to some of the player contract. I know you and Ben talked about how the dice sort of work.
Right.
You're assembling a dice pool. It can work really well to have basically one big pile of dice, and as the players are, assembling their positive dice, you as the DM slide over the negative dice, sort of building the pool right in front of them.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the nice thing is there's really only, to my knowledge, there's only one manufacturer of those dice right now. So everybody's dice are going to be the same. So you don't have to worry about whose is whose necessarily.
My dice are lucky.
Right. Yeah. I know a lot of people have their dice customs and whatnot. So not everybody might be cool with sharing their dice, but
I think the nature of this system, it actually works fairly well. Nobody seems to mind.
As long as someone's dice isn't all like chewed up or something. You're like, I don't want John's dice that his 3-year-old was gnawing on. I want to make sure I end up with mine at the end of the night.
Right. At the end of the night, you sort of have to keep track of them. But
so what's been your experience with playing these games for the first time and running the game for players who are playing it the first time? What's the learning curve been like for you?
My first attempt, I ran the Edge of the Empire beginners box for a mixed group of players, some that had a fair amount of role-playing experience, some that had none. And I did not love it. I'll confess that up front. It was so different from what I was used to that I felt I didn't do a good job. But revisiting that and playing with some other folks who had played with it, by about the third time I ran it, not the third time I ran the box, but the third session I ran of the system, I fell in love. So it's definitely the sort of thing that your first time may be a little rocky because it is so different.
Yeah.
But it doesn't take very long to learn.
Cool.
And from my player's perspective, my wife plays. She's not a mechanics person. And she gets the dice. She gets the system pretty easily. I have some other folks in my regular group who are really mechanic crunch junkies, and they love it. So I find that to be a rare balance.
Yeah. Your players that you've had, have you dealt mainly with people that are completely new to RPGs or people that are familiar with other games coming over to this one?
I've had a kind of a gradient.
Okay.
I've had some people who've never done RPGs before. A few people who played like first edition D&D and then took a long break.
Okay.
And then, people who, like my wife, who plays regularly, but kind of likes rules light systems. Some of my other players play 3 or 4 games a week, different systems, and like crunchier games. So I find this system has things that can appeal to everybody.
Okay.
The hardest part for most people to get down is the fact that you don't just have success fail.
Right.
And that, especially with the advantage threat axis and the triumph despair axis, you're really handing control over to the player. And you say, okay, what happened? Tell me a story.
Yeah.
And for very new players, that can be challenging. People who've never done an RPG before. And for some people who are used to settings or systems that don't really go there, they kind of freak out.
Yeah, I can totally see that. I also ran the Edge of the Empire beginner adventure, and that's really been my only hands-on experience with the system so far. And all of my players were new to the game, but they'd all played RPGs before. So I didn't have the experience of having someone that was completely new to everything. at the table. And even with my group, it kind of took some time for people to really get into telling that story, based on the role, and instead of just saying, oh, I succeeded or I failed.
Well, and it took time for me as the GM to give players that freedom. It was really, and one of the things I think I did poorly at first was, oh, you got 2 advantage, maybe you should do this.
Okay.
Rather than giving them the freedom they need.
Yeah. You've played the game too from the other side of the table, right?
I have. And that's what actually pulled me back after I sort of botched botched is too strong. It was a fun session. Everybody had fun, but I didn't feel I did a job with the beat box. But a friend of mine was running a demo game at our local game store and said, hey, why don't you come play? So after a session or 2 playing with him, he then, for personal reasons, stepped away from the table for a while and asked me to substitute GM for him. And that was kind of trial by fire at that point.
So did you take over that adventure, or did you start a new adventure?
We transitioned. We had just begun an adventure, so we turned it into something that was mine. And it wound up being kind of an interesting transhuman sideline.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so you can take the system kind of some interesting ways. And then he came back for a little bit and had to leave again, and I did a whole adventure kind of from start to finish of my own that was less weird, less transhuman.
Well, would you like to tell us a little bit about your transhuman adventure in Star Wars? That sounds really cool.
Oh, okay. So the idea, the players had gone looking for a lost scout ship, and we had talked back and forth that the person who was in it was actually the daughter of a Moff, and we concluded that she was actually looking to escape her controlling father by tracking down this ancient technology that would allow her essentially to become, for lack of a better word, an immortal organic droid type being.
Oh, cool.
And to do that, she had to use this ancient warfleet to trigger, turn a brown dwarf into a fully functioning star. So the adventure was igniting a failed star, borrowing heavily from Arthur C. Clarke in his 2001, 2000, the various books in that series, turning a gas giant into a fully functioning star.
Awesome.
It involves some crazy pirate, an Imperial fleet, an Imperial warship and a bunch of TIE fighters flying through the rings of a Saturn-like planet, dealing with psychotic droids who had been programmed to eliminate imperfect humans, which was everyone. And then at the end, they sort of have this experience where they had to either let this person go through this transformation or try and stop it.
Well, that sounds awesome.
I thought it was pretty cool. I think the canon junkies probably freak out, but the system allows for this flexibility.
Yeah. Well, and that's one thing cool that I didn't even realize until you were talking about that I really like about Edge of the Empire specifically, although I imagine Age of Rebellion is similar in that, like, you can really kind of focus on Star Wars as science fiction without, Jedi running around, making it feel more like fantasy.
Yeah. Which
is really cool. Kind of more on the sci-fi side of the sci-fi space opera spectrum. That's really cool.
And I would say even incorporating the Force, if you avoid the Jedi, there are elements of it that still fit in really well with a lot of the science fiction.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, a telepath is a telepath.
Right. Yeah.
So you can create, and in Edge in particular, you can create interesting perspectives on things.
That's very cool. Yeah, that's awesome because I've just had experience with the beginner adventure in Edge, and I also have I think it's called Fragments from the Rim or something like that. One of their other published adventures.
Beyond the Rim.
Fragments from the Rim, that was like a West End Games book. I think that was a smuggler book.
Yeah, and there's also a podcast.
Okay. Yeah, that was one of the D6 books, I think. I remember that.
Yeah, I've been going back through my library of D6 books for inspiration and things like that.
I wish I still had mine. Kicking myself now.
I don't have all of them, but you do what you can.
So how would you compare your experiences with this system with some other narrative games that are less crunchy?
So I run a Fate game, a Dresden Files game.
Okay, cool.
I've played in a couple of Fate games. I toyed with a super narrative system like Nobilis. I think this one has a lot of the same narrative power that you see in Fate or others. The mechanism of the destiny point,
Okay.
the mechanism of the triumphs and the despairs. There's a real strong element for the players to narrate, but it has more mechanical hooks,
Okay.
which allow you to tinker and sort of explore with. So one of the challenges I find with Fate is everything gets resolved the same way, and after a while, doing a great big ritual summons or investigating murder, it all feels the same.
Okay. Yeah.
That said, we've used variants on the Fate city or game creation to really good effect to set up Star Wars campaigns. One of the hosts of the Hydean Way, Cameron Kalka, Ben's co-host, he just started one recently, and we went through that, and it works really, really well. So having that structure to create a setting is pretty awesome.
Well, can you tell us more about that? How that works?
Sure. So for folks who aren't familiar with Fate, your first section is really the game creation. Mm-hmm. Now, for Dresden Files, they refer to it as a city creation because you're creating your location. And you go through and you create some of the themes and challenges that are affecting your location. So for Cameron's game, we picked a sector, actually a sector that we invented whole cloth in that session, that interacted with a couple other sectors. And, once we decided what the themes were, what things we wanted to deal with, we created a couple planetary systems, a couple planets, NPCs, and locations on those planets. So a shadow port that is home to a mechanic that's out to try and prove something. So she's willing to work with slightly shady characters, or a asteroid space station that's run by a retired clone trooper who, for whatever reason, is able to keep the Empire out, and everybody's nervous about what deals he's made. So at that point, all the players suddenly have NPCs to hook into.
Cool.
And stories to hook to. And that's nice.
Very cool. I imagine that helps a bit with player buy-in, having them involved in creating things like that in the very beginning.
It does. It also takes some of the work off the GM. You don't have to write a 30-page document,
right?
But everybody still knows where they can go to for ship repairs, where they can go to fence potentially illicitly acquired things. Everybody knows that when we see this pirate ship, that we're in for a really bad fight.
Awesome.
The nature of the Star Wars RPG is such that you can borrow from some of these more narrative systems and have it work really well.
Very cool. And then kind of on the other side of the coin, how would you compare it with games that are a bit more crunchy, like, say, D&D?
Well, so it has some things that are similar to D&D in that it has the careers and specialty paths. But instead of once you pick in, D&D 5th edition, once you pick your archetype or whatever within the class, you kind of have a linear progression.
Yeah.
And sure, you can do the weird multi-classing and stuff like that, but by and large, you're on a single trajectory. With this system, you've got a lot more freedom to develop your character. And because of the way the mechanical hooks are in the system, you can still have some complex character designs. You could have, for example, 2 pilots, but they develop in 2 different ways and they look mechanically very different. I think that's one of the best things about this system is that the mechanics, crunch, reinforces the narrative. Where in D&D, because it's a generic system, that connection is looser. And unlike, I'll poke at Numenera a little, which I haven't had a chance to play, but I've read, you have the 3 classes,
mm-hmm.
and there's a lot of stuff you can do within them, but at the end of the day, you have 3 classes.
Right.
This way, mechanically, the mechanics are complex enough to support much more variation in base careers. So I think it strikes a really neat balance between mechanics and narrative.
Cool. Yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying when you were talking about with Fate, how after a while, everything kind of started to feel the same mechanically. The cipher system, which Numenera uses, is very much the same way. There's one kind of mechanic that you use, and it doesn't matter if you're in combat or you're doing a social thing or you're trying to figure something out. It all uses the exact same mechanic. You do the same die roll, and it was like that for me. I played a lot of Numenera for about a year and a half, almost exclusively, and it got to where it just like everything started to feel kind of the same. So then I started getting more into D&D 5th edition and now Star Wars. And it's nice to have kind of a little more to dig your teeth into mechanically and a little more variation to what's going on.
Mm-hmm. The neat thing this has is, while it has a lot more crunch than Fate, unlike, say, Shadowrun, where there's lots and lots of rules for everything, they don't have, I would say it's not over mechanics.
Yeah.
They illustrate a few key cases, what happens if you're in hostile environments and basically you're having setbacks. And you apply that hostile environment rule across a range from being on a lava planet to being underwater to being in the vacuum of space.
Cool.
And so you don't have to remember lots of niche rules.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an interesting balance.
Yeah, and for me, that's kind of where it is somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. Because I think of like 3rd edition D&D and like Pathfinder, where they had a lot of very specific rules for very specific situations. And I'm not so much a fan of that.
Well, and you hadn't even reached the levels of Traveler or
right.
Rollmaster or things like that.
I made a Rollmaster character once. And that took longer than a lot of game sessions I've played in. And by the time I was done making the character, it was really fun. I had a lot of fun making that character, but I just was mystified as to how this could actually play as a game because it was so complex. Unless we were all androids at the table.
Yeah, it's a very challenging system.
Yeah. But after having so much experience with the very rules light system, like the cipher system, that's really nice for if you just want to kind of on a whim run a game and you don't want to, or you don't have time to prepare. That system's really easy to just do things on the fly with no prep or forethought, really.
Yeah.
But it does get kind of samey.
Well, that's the cool thing about this game. Because the core mechanic is pretty straightforward. It's figure out the difficulty, figure out your skills, and build a dice pool around that. And then figure out what the environmental modifiers are. You can actually do that pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Not quite D&D 4th edition prep, which I got to be able to whip up a decent session in about 10 minutes because it was so mechanically driven.
Okay.
You could sort of pull pieces together really fast and have an encounter and run for a session with that. This is, I think, about 20 to 30 minutes to prep, like formal prep.
Okay.
For my weekly game. Though during the week I'm thinking about it and so forth.
Right.
But
right.
Putting stats to a page is a 20 to 30 minute process.
Nice.
For an evening session. So it's pretty light on the prep.
Very cool. It kind of reminds me a bit of the old World of Darkness system, which I used to run a lot. I used to run a lot of Vampire and Changeling. The system was very similar in that you had an attribute and a skill that you then built a dice pool with. And I found it very easy to just do things on the fly with that system and just come up with rulings, even though there might have been a specific rule somewhere, just come up with something on the fly. The Star Wars system seems very similar to me, and in a way it seems even easier because you're not adding those together. Instead, you're upgrading dice, where in the old White Wolf system, you could end up with just ungodly dice pools and counting all these successes, where the way Star Wars does it, instead of taking all your dice from your attribute and all your dice from your ability and adding those all in, those are upgrading some of them.
Yeah.
Which I think is a little quicker, it seems like.
Well, I'm a huge fan of the classic World of Darkness, so more Werewolf, Mage, Changeling.
Cool.
And Exalted is still my number one game.
Oh, nice.
I'm waiting for 3rd edition to drop, but it does have a very similar feel in terms of running and prep. So
Now, I know in this game you can get a big fistful of dice, so I'm not saying that you can't.
I think the biggest pool I've had hit the table, the player had native 6 dice, like 3 yellows and 3 greens, and then had picked up 3 or 4 boost dice, and then their difficulty was 4 reds and a purple, and had 6 set back. So, that's a big fistful of dice.
Yeah, and the thing that makes these pools bigger is you're adding dice for opposition as well, where in the White Wolf system, you didn't have that. They were just all from your character's stuff, and then you're rolling against a static number. So maybe half of those dice in your pool are coming from your character sheet, and the other half are coming from the GM and what they're throwing at you.
And that allows you to steal from the cipher system, where you can basically invert dice pool to allow the players to do the majority of the rolling.
I was wondering about that. I was wondering how hard it would be to do that. It seemed like it would be fairly easy to work that out.
I do it pretty routinely on stealth checks or perception kinds of things. It's a little harder in combat because those are generally fixed pools. Everybody works against the same targets.
Okay.
And it's slightly less satisfying to say rolling 2 green dice against a full field of reds and purples.
Yeah.
Because your difficulty is 2. But you can do it. And I've done that once or twice, and it sort of created some interesting dynamics because players will use different powers in those circumstances.
That reminds me of something. I was listening to the interview I did with Ben, and I realized that there was something very basic about the dice system of this game that we never really pointed out for people that have no experience with it. And that's that the dice are color-coded, which is so awesome. So like your basic difficulty dice and ability dice are 8-sided, right? And so the difficulties are purple and the ability ones are green, and then your upgrade dice are D12s, and then they're yellow if they're the good kind, and they're red if they're the bad kind. And so it makes it really easy.
Your environmental modifier dice are 6-siders, and they're either blue if they're good or black if they're bad.
Yeah.
It makes visually the pool is very, very easy to look at.
Right.
And you can use that actually to narrate the results. For example, if all the cancellations that save somebody come from black dice that they put on the pool because they have a defensive shield or something like that, well, your shield blocked the attack. If it instead comes from red dice you put in because of your skills, well, then your super skills let you avoid the problem.
Yeah. And I have to say, from just a purely tactile, almost childlike perspective, I like games where I get to roll a lot of dice, and I like games where I get to roll different dice. Most of my experience with Numenera has been as a GM, and I found when I finally started playing it that I found it a little unfulfilling, because in that game, 99% of the time you're rolling a D20, and maybe a few times in the session you might roll a D6, and that's it. And the rest of your polyhedral set you're not even going to use. And I started out on D&D. I'm like, I want to use my D12 once in a while,
And that was the challenge with the White Wolf system, right? Sure, you're rolling a fistful of dice, but it's all D10.
Yeah. I still have so many D10s from those days.
Well, and from my days of D6 Star Wars, I have a lot of D6s. I have an obscene number of D10s.
Yeah. You can't get bricks of D10s, though. I have a brick of D6s from my Star Wars days. Yeah. But D10s don't brick very well.
No, I have a tackle box full of them.
Nice. But that's one thing, that's cool about Star Wars is you get to use all the different polyhedral dice, which is awesome. And the thing that I think is so cool about it, the way they've done it, is, compare like teaching someone to play Star Wars who's never played an RPG before versus teaching someone D&D. And, I've heard a lot of people talking about 5th edition, about this is their first RPG they've ever played. And what everyone says is the hardest thing for them learning the game is actually knowing what die to roll when, and knowing the difference between a D8 and a D10 and a D12 and a D20, just because they're, when you're not familiar with them, you have to sit there and actually count this. How many sides is on this one? And the Star Wars game makes it so easy because they're color coded. So the GM can just say, roll this many purple dice and this many green dice. And you don't even need to know what a D8 or a D12 is to be able to do that.
And because it's a D8, a D12, and a D6, they're visually very distinct.
Yeah, right.
You don't have that confusion of a D8 with a D10.
Right.
Or the worst is the D12 with the D20.
Yeah.
We've all had that.
Yeah.
Grab the wrong one.
I still occasionally will grab the wrong one between a D10 and a D8 if I'm just not paying attention because they're so similar.
Yeah. And, even though there are names for all the symbols, so that's the other thing about the dice. They don't have numbers, they have symbols. A little starburst, a little rebel crest, funky triangle. My wife doesn't even call them successes or advantage or things like that. Starburst. And,
Nice.
She knows failure. The advantage, she generally says, the little crab thingies. You don't have to know,
right,
to make the system work.
Yeah,
and so it's pretty intuitive. And
the symbols are kind of convey what they are. Like the successes look like a little explosion, I think. Which is that's a good thing.
Triumph is this cool lightsaber, sword.
Yeah,
sort of thing. Looks very triumphant.
I'm curious, have you had any players who don't like numbers? And how did they like having dice that don't have numbers on them? Because I have had players who don't like adding and subtracting or any kind of math, and they find just as soon as you start throwing numbers at them, they get intimidated. And I've wondered if people like that, if this would be a little easier because there's no numbers.
I haven't had anybody express a dislike of the numbers.
Okay.
But people do seem to like just line them up, cancel symbols, and what's left is what's left.
Yeah.
And it's really fun to hear things like, oh, this is what I've got. And usually that's followed by, I have this many triumphs, I have this many despairs, sometimes simultaneously.
Yeah, very cool. Now, I'm curious, and I don't think I mentioned this in the other interview, but in the core book, and it's probably in the beginner box too, I'm not sure, but they actually have a chart for if you don't want to go buy the special dice where you can use your regular polyhedral dice. Have you tried that? Because it seems like it'd be really actually difficult to do that.
I haven't tried it because I started with the beginner box that had the dice, and FFG has a dice app that's expensive as far as apps go, but not particularly expensive. It's $5, I think. I just use that.
Yeah. And if you play online, someone has come up with a great dice rolling app for Google Hangouts.
Yes.
For the Star Wars dice, which is really cool.
That's what my group uses now for our online game. And it works very well.
I have to admit, I'm usually the kind of person that will save $1 or even a penny anywhere I can. And I was a little resistant and skeptical about these dice, kind of like, here's just a way to make you buy their dice instead of using your bag full of dice that you already have. But when I got the Edge of the Empire core book and I looked at that chart, well, first of all, by that point, by the time I got there, I was already kind of sold on the dice system, just reading, how they present it in the book and what they do for you. And I'm like, okay, yeah, this isn't just some gimmick to make a few bucks. This is actually doing something that you can't do with regular dice. And then when I saw that chart and I looked at it, I was like, yeah, you could do that, but talk about slowing down play. I'm just going to go buy some dice.
Yeah, I had pretty much the same thought when I first heard, they're using proprietary dice. It's like, really? Come on, guys. Couldn't you come up with something that would work? But I agree. You couldn't do this with existing dice.
Yeah.
The numbers get in the way.
Yeah, it's like translating from one language to another. It's just slow everything down. I guess you could try it. If you want to try the system and you don't want to go buy the dice until you're sure you're going to like it.
Well, I think that's what people did with the Edge of the Empire beta because the dice weren't out.
Oh, okay.
They actually had a sheet with little stickers.
Oh, now that'd be all right. That'd be better than trying to match numbers on a chart. That'd be cool.
But the dice aren't that expensive.
Right.
Especially if you buy the beginner boxes.
Yeah.
They're well worth it.
Yeah. I'm really planning to get the Force and Destiny beginner box, even though I think it's very likely that I will ultimately end up getting the core book because I just, for the dice and the adventure and everything else you get and the minis, it's worth it. Even if you go and buy the book.
The beginner game doesn't take you very far.
Yeah.
You get the adventure in it. They have a digital adventure that follows up on it. But eventually, you'll probably want the core book.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
And certainly from what I've seen, in the Force and Destiny beta, wow, it's going to be awesome.
The art is amazing. I was looking at some of the art. I was so excited to see someone with a turquoise lightsaber.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it's not an original idea, but long ago, I was like, if I had a Jedi, I would have a turquoise lightsaber. And I finally got to see a picture of one. It was really cool. Just like I always imagined it.
And that's the really cool thing about what they've done. And I think Ben touched on this with the canon reset for Legends.
Mm-hmm.
The game has a lot more flexibility than some previous systems because you can do whatever. There's no rules for what color lightsaber you can have.
Right. Or this class has to have this color and this class has to have that color.
They, in fact, don't mention lightsaber color in the rules for the beta. They may mention something later, but
yeah,
which is nice.
Yeah.
You want to have a purple lightsaber? You want to have a turquoise lightsaber? Cool.
What does it matter, right? There's no conceivable mechanical difference.
Right.
It's like, no, you can't do that.
I mean, you do have the red lightsaber stigma.
Right.
But okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I always wondered about that. There's got to be some Sith out there or some dark side users that just don't want red just because it's just not their jam. It's like everybody's got red. I want something different.
Yeah.
They need more dark side colors.
I think so. I on Star Wars: The Old Republic, I like putting orange.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Yeah, totally.
That just sort of in the spirit of this game system. Just enough crunch to give you cool things to do, but otherwise wide open.
Yeah. It seems like it would be pretty easy to just come up with your own race or come up with your own starship or come up with your own whatever.
Well, there's a bunch of folks that when Edge of the Empire came out, they created the unofficial species menagerie. And they have like 60 species in there.
Wow.
For player characters. And as more books and supplements have come out, some of those have been given an official treatment. And it's interesting how close those often were because the mechanics are so intuitive.
Very cool. That's awesome. Well, that is going to wrap up episode 32 of Game Master's Journey. Thanks again to Joshua for the great interview, and make sure and tune in for episode 33 to hear the second part of the interview. If you would like to reach me, send me an email at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Google+, just search for Lex Starwalker, and you can follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker. If you'd like to find Joshua on Twitter, he's at Joshua Evan Brown. And he also has another Twitter account at exalted_hooks, where he posts exalted adventure ideas. Please visit the website, starwalkerstudios.com, where you can find the show notes for this episode, and you can find our other podcasts there. And you can also find a link to our Google Plus community, and I really hope you'll join in the discussions there. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to help this show continue to be a success and help us keep the lights on at the studio, a great way that you can do so is to try a free trial of Audible books courtesy of Game Master's Journey. You can find all the information about that at the bottom of the show notes on the website at starwalkerstudios.com. Another great way to support the show is to become a patron. Just click on the Patreon button at the top of the show notes and you can go check out our Patreon page. Really appreciate all the patrons of the show. You can also give a one-time donation. Just click on the pink donate button at the top of the page at starwalkerstudios.com. And other great ways that you can help us out is to use our Amazon referral links, which you will find at the bottom of the show notes, as well as leaving a review of the show on iTunes or Stitcher. Just click on the iTunes or Stitcher button at the top of the show notes, and it will take you directly to our show on iTunes or Stitcher. And I really appreciate the reviews that you leave. So thank you once again for listening to the show and supporting the show. I really appreciate it. And I hope I will be seeing you back next week for the continuation of this excellent interview. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney.